Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, March 9, 2026. And if you would all please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Clerk Tamer, please call the roll.
Toludo.
Here.
Baker.
Here.
Nudera.
Here.
Virgil.
Here.
Nardini.
Here.
Bastido.
Here.
Irby.
Here.
Brennan.
Here.
Bellinger.
Here.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. Varimas.
Here.
Janko.
Here.
Hill.
Here.
Graham.
Here.
Jensen.
Here.
14 present, 0 absent.
14 present, 0 absent. We have a quorum. Item 2, announcements. Are there any announcements from the dais? Seeing none. Clerk Tamer, has anyone signed in for public comment this evening?
Nobody's signed in.
All right. And is there anyone in the audience that would like to make public comment that did not have an opportunity to do so before the meeting? Please raise your hand. Seeing as we'll close public forum. We'll go on to item 5, which is the business before the committee. By way of background, in December of 2019, there was a contract entered into between the city of Elmhurst and Camiros. It was approved by the city council. Please excuse all mispronunciations as we go forward. Arista Strungus has been the lead consultant working on this project from the start. She is in attendance this evening. She's going to provide an overview and update. The project was delayed from April 2020 to early 2021 due to the pandemic, which you've heard about. The first public draft was released in July 2023. We've had 2 public open houses in September 2023 to gather input from the public. The second draft of the report was released in June of 24. The current draft is the third draft following public feedback and significant review by the DPZ Committee and the ZMP Commission. The ZMP Commission held public hearings on the current draft at 4 meetings, October 28, 2025, November 4, December 2nd, 2025, and then in January 6 of 2026. And a memo dated January 20th summarizes their recommendations. So the next step after tonight, it'll go back to DPZ for their review before coming back to the council. So this will be a very well-traveled report. What I'd like to accomplish tonight is to have Arista present the report. We're not here to debate the findings, but I wanted to, because this is an important project, and instead of having her just appear before the committee again and then having sort of a report back from the committee of what she said there, is to hear what was done, how it was done, so that if any procedural questions, anyone can ask those questions. Then DPZ will review it, and we will have the usual thorough report back from DPZ, at which time we would debate anything that they do or don't do. So if we're clear on that, Arista, if you would like to present, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you all for having me here tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this most recent version of the zoning code. Mr. Mayor, you kind of took a couple of thunder from my first few slides. I just wanted to go over a timeline, but the mayor did a really good job of this. But just to say, this is a project that's been going on for a while, starting back in November 2019. A lot of public input in that initial part with stakeholder interviews, a lot of analysis of the current code, including GIS analysis of the districts, obviously the pause for COVID. We had released a technical report that talked about the directions that we wanted to go in with this draft, and that came out in 2021 with presentations in January of 2022. We then began drafting the ordinance with a lot of work with staff, really understanding what's going on and trying to get the nuances correct, leading to that public release of a draft in 2023, and as the mayor mentioned, a series of open houses for the public to come hear a presentation and to speak one-on-one with staff and the consultant team. So obviously, there was a commission review of the draft from August to November of 2023, 4 meetings, leading to the second public draft. So there's been a number of iterations of this document, which was released in June of 2024. The commission review of the draft from August 2024 to March 2025, 5 meetings. A little bit longer time frame there because Thanksgiving and Christmas kind of pop up in the middle. A release of the public hearing draft in September of 2025, and then the public hearings held between October and December with the deliberation in January 2026. So really you can see there's been a lot of iterations of this code, a lot of public vetting, a lot of meetings. Staff has attended significantly more meetings to review these with the different commissions. So really a lot of input that we've gathered over these many years. So what I'm going to do is just really kind of a quick overview of what is in this draft. Obviously, it's a zoning ordinance, so there's a lot of detail. I don't want to take you through that. We'd be here for many, many hours. I'm happy to do it, but I get to sit if we want to do that. So really what you're looking at here is a fully reorganized code. This is something very different from the way that the current code is organized. Begins with introductory articles, Article 1, which is the title, purpose, and intent, as well as Article 2, which is a kind of full definitions of all the general terms used in the code, as well as how you measure things, so it's always consistent, always in one place. Kind of the heart of the beast is really found in Articles 3 through Article 9, the various districts, as well as the uses that are allowed within them, really just making sure we're addressing each of those character areas of the districts. Kind of once we move away from the principal building on the lot and the principal uses, we start seeing the other things that can happen on a lot. So you have general development standards, things like a site triangle that you want to make sure safety is preserved, accessory structures, the whole series of parking, loading, and bicycle parking, as well as landscape and signs. And then finally, we kind of close out the code as a whole with a series of administrative provisions, really that just talk about, you know, who does what, how do you do it, and what happens when I've done it, as well as nonconformities and enforcement. So, as I said, this is a complete reorganization of the code. It looks very different from what your current code is, and we think is really organized in a way that's much more user-friendly. It's compartmentalized. You no longer have a general provision section where you just start throwing random stuff into it and hope everybody finds it when they're putting forth development. So things are now kind of all in their proper place. As you see, significantly more graphics, using a consistent voice and terminology throughout, which is what happens when you undertake a rewrite. Definitions of all the different terms, making sure those are comprehensive. And again, as I mentioned, making sure the measurement methodologies are consistent. They're all in one place. They're just applied consistently when someone's looking to measure building height, lot area, lot width. It's all within that section. So the first section, you know, and a lot of what Elmhurst is the residential district. So we did some simplification here, really looking at the dimensional standards and simplifying them rather than singling out uses. We look at things such as residential and non-residential, even with some standards for specific residential types. We clarified lot coverage and lot width calculations. You know, one of the things we heard early on were issues with box outs. How do we address those? This code addresses those. We really looked at refining the different things that make up the residential districts, the heights, the setbacks, the coverage. So you really see that kind of worked out throughout all of the various residential districts. FAR was removed. We did maintain the stories for single-family and two-family dwellings, and created separate townhouse and multifamily standards, including some level of design standards, kind of the good bones of architecture for multifamily and townhouse. So you see here, I won't make you read the whole table, but just to kind of outline how these districts go, you see they start with the largest, the residential estate, the RE at 12,000 square foot lots. These are the biggest lots in the residential districts, and then kind of going down. So things like the R1, the R1A, the R2. The R2A is a new district of a smaller lot size. Initially, when we had done some analysis on the map, we saw it was appropriate for this. I know we're not doing any map changes at this stage, but the district is ready to go when you would like to look at that and perhaps apply that. Then finally, looking at the districts that have much more of a mix of dwelling types. The R3, you can see there, single family through townhouse. Then in the R4 and the R5, we start to get into allowing for multifamily as well. The RNT district is really just the NT district from the central business district, moved over with its friends in the residential district. So really a kind of more appropriate place for that district. So renamed the RNT district. For commercial, we did, again, a lot of...
Question.
Sorry.
I've been around for a while, but what is NT?
Neighborhood
RNT?
transition? Neighborhood transition.
Oh, the zone, all right.
Yeah, it was the CBD neighborhood transition. The downtown neighborhood transition just moved to residential as neighborhood
All right,
transition.
thank you.
So the commercial districts, you see here a lot of intention taken to really kind of form the way new commercial development would look. So we looked at things like eliminating the FAR. You won't see that in this section. Eliminated density controls, increased the heights a little bit in certain districts. And then in the ones where you had a 55-foot base height, but then allowed for additional height by conditional use, at this point in the draft, that has been maintained. The C5 is a new district, the commercial mixed use, to address some of the goals of the sub-area plans that you've adopted over the years. So again, it's just having that back pocket district that you can put on the ground when you're ready to use it and implement parts of those plans. There is some sensitivities, understanding kind of, the stitching here is very tight. Residential is on top of commercial. So some height limitations in the C3, C4, C5. If you're within a certain amount of distance from a single family or two family or townhouse, there's a height that you have to meet before you can go to the maximum height of the district. And again, whole series of design standards in particular for commercial. Again, trying to just shape the good bones of architecture, but not becoming the architecture police.
May I ask a question?
Alderman Nardini.
Thanks.
Sure.
Re-say what you just said. I lost you about the second to last thing that you just said.
Alderman Nardini, make sure you pull your microphone down so we're recording.
Is it about the height or about design?
No, I think height. I said away from the microphone that I missed the second to last thing that you said, and now I can't remember exactly what it was.
So we have a height, basically a height transition in the C3, C4, C5 districts. Basically says maximum building height within 200 feet of a lot currently used as single-family, two-family, or townhouse is limited to 40 feet. So essentially, when you're that close to single-family, two-family, townhouse, you're limited to 40 feet before you can hit the full height of the district. So it's a transition in those areas where that happens.
Thanks.
Alderman Hill, did you have your hand up?
Yes, thanks. Why, just very quickly, why was FAR eliminated as a bulk control?
Because we really, FAR just kind of in its natural origin is really something done for skyscrapers, really big buildings. And we thought by shaping things through building coverage, through the setbacks, through the design standards, through things like build to zones and build to percentages, we can do a much more predictable, better way of shaping the buildings that we want to see or that we want to allow. So that's really where that came in.
Thanks.
Alderman Toluta, did you have a question?
I was going to ask about the FAR as well. I mean, in a layman's term, can you give an example of how that will affect a builder building something in Elmhurst from before when FAR was in place and after when FAR is not in place? Like, what can we as non-builder people expect to see a difference from your professional opinion by changing that?
I think the parameters are much more clear. You know where the building's going to sit on the lot now. You know how tall it can be. You know kind of how it's going to address things around it, in particular if it's got standards that require it to be closer to the street. FAR is just a formula. So it's basically saying I can multiply my lot times X amounts, and that's how much square footage I can have. When really what's important is how big is that building? Where's that building sitting in the lot, and how tall can it be? And so that's really what it makes it easier for both those on the other side. When they're designing the building, they don't have to play games with FAR. In particular, you see it in residential. They can play games with ceiling heights and things like that to kind of maximize it. Here you've got, it can be this tall, it has to sit on this part of the lot, it has to meet these design standards.
Follow up?
Sure.
The other request as you continue to go through this, if it would be helpful for me and I hope other people, anywhere where there is a why for the decision that was made, if you could just give a little bit of context for that, Just similar to the FAR explanation, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are some newer aldermen, and maybe those who haven't served on the committee, but FAR, floor area ratio, whatever, you're going to use an acronym if you just want to mention what it is. But thank you. Anyone else before we go on? Alderman Brand.
I will not ask another question about FAR, even though I do have one. Is this presentation currently online, either on board docs or on the website or anything?
It's going to be.
It'll be on the project website tomorrow when I get home and upload it.
It will be on the DPZ agenda, I believe, meeting next.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry?
It'll be on the DPZ. That's an acronym for,
Yes.
So next meeting for them. I was just pointing out to the council. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. So you can see here the structure of the commercial districts. So the O1 office, this is very similar to the current. It's a transitional district from, commercial to kind of higher commercial. So it's similar to the current. The lot area was reduced to 5,000 for things to be a little bit more in conformity, so the lots that are there meet the standard. The C1 local commercial, again, the height was increased to 40 to allow for some additional stories above, which is really kind of the height to get you to that, 3-story building. The C2 community commercial, again, this is one of these where the base height was increased to 55 with 75 by conditional use permit. Again, with that transition that we just talked about when you're near residential. Again, just to kind of give these structures the ability to get a height that gives them multiple floors and really kind of works for these types of building designs. You see here the C3 general commercial. Again, same thing with the height, exactly as I just explained. The C4 commercial industrial mixed use. This includes the C3A district that you currently have now. We just consolidated these. Again, very similar, the base heights at the 55 with 75 by conditional use. And then finally, the C5 commercial mixed use district. This is very similar to the C4, but it has some residential allowed. It creates that commercial mixed use environment that many of the sub-area plans spoke to, but we didn't quite have a district that matched what those wanted to do. So we created one for the time when that would be appropriate for them to be put on the map. The next up is the central business districts. What we did here really was some refinements, again, bringing in elements of design for the CBD. As we talked about, we eliminated FAR and stories. We just talk about heights, so you can see them illustrated there. In the core, the outer core, 77 feet, the outer core residential, 72 feet. Again, in that core, you can go up to 125 by conditional use. This is a current standard. We maintain this. Understand some of this area may be under study, but really to what we're doing in this code, we're not really bringing that in at this point. Again, that transition for the outer core and the outer core residential that has that height transition when you're abutting single family, 2-family, or townhouse, that is also repeated here with some limitations on height within that first 100 feet. What we did as was a number of build to zones and build to percentages. What these really talk about is where you're required to place your building on the lot. So it's the idea of bringing buildings closer to the street to create that pedestrian environment, that desired street wall. So that's really kind of shaping how the building sits on the lot in a more prescriptive way. So we added that in, understanding kind of the value of the CBD and having that walkable pedestrian environment. Continued the 0-foot build-to lines for interior sides, which is current, and then...
1 second. Alderman Toledo.
Sorry, just from a practical matter, what you just mentioned about the build-to zone and where they can build the building on the lot, would that eliminate things like we just passed a variation for a building on York Street because the way the zoning is written, they were going to have to build it a foot back from the kind of like the wall line of the street, and they needed a variance to build it to what we want. Mm-hmm. Would this eliminate those types of variances in the future?
Well, I can't speak specifically to that case. I don't know that case. But really what it does, it provides, it's about 0 to a 5-foot area to provide a little bit of flexibility to move in that initial thing. But you could align without having to get a variance since you're allowed to go 0 to 5. So it really should be
But then we could
easier.
result in some that are 5 feet off of that wall front.
I mean, it can, but it's such a kind of the 5-foot difference, really, when you're starting to look at a pedestrian environment. A little bit of that modulation is not necessarily a bad thing. It kind of doesn't make you feel walled in, but it's small enough that it doesn't disturb the pedestrian street wall.
And it gives flexibility to the...
Right, and you never know where that 0 is. That's the problem with 0-foot build-to lines, is you're not always sure where that line really lives.
Yeah,
So.
okay, thank you.
And Brennan? Is your...
Yes, so mine was on the prior slide, so if you want to finish this, oh, okay.
Well, I had one comment here on this one was, this also has design standards to make sure that buildings look good. Okay, that was all I had on this one.
Yeah, so very fascinating, by the way. This is not a space I spend a lot of time in. So I see a lot of, on the commercial side of this, a lot of increase to the height, to 55. I don't know what the prior standard was, but what drives that decision to go to a higher level? Is it a more modern standard? Are other communities adopting this code? Is this, what drives an increase versus leaving it alone?
Typically what drives the, and what kind of drove the increase here was to allow for multiple story buildings. If you put that height too low, you really can't put in, ground floor commercial with residential of 2 floors or 3 floors of residential above, because you want that higher first floor. You want that, 14-foot, 15-foot, 16-foot ground floor so that you see storefronts and you see the way people kind of move through the downtown, but then having enough flexibility to create true mixed use, whether it be all residential above or like a layer of office and then residential above that. So it's just providing a little bit more flexibility to be able to design the building for that.
Awesome, thank you for that.
All right. Alderman Nardini?
Thanks. Briefly, one, this is super fascinating. When you said you'd never really know where that 0 line is, why not? Because of buildings that have been built before?
Yeah, you probably do. 90% of cases you probably do, but I've worked in areas where people don't know where that property line, the official property line, really sits. And so that little bit of flexibility doesn't get you out of conformance by not sitting exactly on it. And this is something we've seen kind of throughout the country. I do a lot of work throughout the country. Just to introduce, I've been working in zoning for over 25 years. Worked a lot in Illinois. I'm from Chicago. You could tell from the accent. So did a lot of work around here and work a lot nationally. And just the ability to say the building's got to be sitting right on that lot line has been difficult for community after community to really make sure they're getting it.
One quick other thing about design standards. We removed a bunch of, from, I think, draft 1 to draft, one of the drafts redlined out all of our material requirements, the consistency of facades and things like that. When you say we have design standards, reconcile that with the fact that we are not obliging consistent facade and wraparound materials.
So we do have some prohibitions on materials that we don't want to see. So building materials have not been completely stricken. What we're looking at more is providing a little bit more flexibility and creativity for people that you can get good buildings that use multiple materials. And if you're abutting residential, you're abutting a street, you have to use, good materials that match on those facades. Issues like required transparency, which is the percentage of windows on the ground floor and on the upper stories for buildings that are not, single family, but required blank wall limitations, so you can't just have these big expanses of blank thing. So it's really what we've done is we've set the kind of the standards for let's get good looking buildings, but let's not get super restrictive that it's got to be this material all the way around, because then it just all starts to look the same.
Alderman Virgil?
So those design standards that you're talking about, is that incorporating elements of like a form-based code?
Sort of. Form-based code, over time, it's got some good things in it that really help to shape the form of a building. Sorry to use the name and the definition. So things like when you look at things like a build-to zone or a build-to percentage or things that talk about kind of the design of buildings or transparency, there are techniques that existed before form-based codes and then some that came in with form-based codes. So really what you've got here is a hybrid that's taking good things from all the different zoning techniques that are out there and then using them to really address your specific situation.
Okay, yeah, that's what it sounded like.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. So the industrial districts. So these are honestly maintained, they're very similar to what they are now. The industrial districts, we allowed them to go up to 55 feet as a base height standard. This is a height that we're seeing frequently asked for within the industrial districts of a code just based on how people are designing industrial buildings. Again, you see that up to 75 feet by conditional use. And then again, where you see this abutting single-family, two-family townhouse within that distance, here we have 200 feet. It's limited down to 35 feet. So it's really meant to create that height transition between residential and industrial uses. So you got some very basic industrial design standards. They're not like the commercial or the CBD, just some very basic things. A lot of them with siting as to where things can locate on the site just to maintain kind of a good quality industrial area. And then finally, there are the special districts. These are really addressing very specific purposes within Elmhurst. So you see the first, the conservation recreation. This is really for larger open space areas, though I want to be clear that parks are allowed in every district, so it's not like you have to be in the CR. But this is really just to protect those areas that are large parks. The CI civic institutional, again, this is for things like where we are now, including, city center. And then educational and institutional buildings, this is where you have a larger campus type environment for these uses. You want to make sure you're addressing what they can do and how they address the perimeters. Same thing for the healthcare campus to accommodate the community hospitals and make sure, again, we're looking at them from a campus perspective. These are very specific. They're targeted very specifically at these types of uses: open space, civic, institutional, and healthcare. And I believe they're all current. Yes, and they all exist right now. So this is basically just carrying over the districts that you've got right now. The other thing that you'll see within the code is really a revised use structure. We really did something very modern here. Created something that is now all contained within one matrix, within one section of the code, within that article. You'll see a matrix that describes all the uses allowed in each of the districts. You'll see that we address both principal and temporary uses. We used what we call a generic use approach. It's really meant to group a number of uses together so that way you don't have to get super specific. So retail, as you can see in this example, includes things like shoe store, clothing store, record store, hardware store. There are some uses that are unique, that are specific, that want to be regulated specifically. Those have been pulled out. So once they're pulled out of that category and they're specifically defined within the matrix, you can't think that they're part of another use. It's a fairly typical way to address uses within codes. It's basically just adopting a modern standard here. And some of these do have use standards associated with them. Those are really intended to address any impacts that may happen because of that use being situated close to something else. So things like a drive-through facility would have standards associated with it to mitigate its impacts on neighboring uses. So when you take a look at the table, this is just one page, it's multiple pages, of the current use structure. And you see what makes it very easy to use is that I can get into this table one of two ways. The first is if, say, in this example, I want to open an art gallery, I just shoot across the table and I can see every district that allows me to do that. Or if I own a piece of property in the, hopefully that says C2, I can go down that column and I can see exactly what permitted and conditional uses are allowed. And if it's blank, I can't have it in that district. So it's really two ways to access the uses depending on how you need to use the table, and really something that is very, very useful as folks are jumping into an ordinance. And you'll see every single one of these uses is now defined, so that makes interpretation and administration much easier. So then, as I said, kind of moving away from the principal uses and the principal buildings on the lot, there's kind of a lot of other stuff that happens within a zoning code, and this is where we start to get into that. There's some standards for general development. These really just apply across lots anywhere within Elmhurst, so really looking at things like the number of structures that are allowed on a lot, prohibition of structures and utility easements, the site visibility triangle, you can see that a graphic illustration of that there, really meant to make sure that you can see around a corner and nobody walking and biking gets hit by a car as you're going around, so it's a very important provision. And then a cross-reference to your current flood provisions. We also created some exterior lighting controls that come into place, including lighting plans for more intensive developments, everything up from townhouse and multifamily to non-residential and mixed use. After some back and forth, this is in the draft that you see now where we are with the foot candle permissions. Fairly typical way to measure light trespass onto adjacent properties. So you can see here, residential against residential or non-residential against residential, 0.2 foot candles. So really trying to minimize that spillage. Non-residential against non-residential, 1 foot candle. Again, fairly typical, especially for non-residential against non-residential. And then we've looked at the prohibited lighting types and some special exceptions for things like recreational fields. Really just a comprehensive set. It doesn't go as far as kind of the lighting standards that you would get in something like dark skies, where you create, lighting zones and things like that. It's kind of a whole different study. What this really does is give you the parameter to really help control glare and trespass and spillage of light onto properties and create that compatibility.
Alderman Toludo?
Thank you. Do we have any lighting standards currently in our code?
I don't know. I can't remember.
In the zoning ordinance, we do for parking lots, and then the building code does have some lighting requirements as well.
So this is a significant increase in regulation for lighting throughout the zoning code.
I don't know
Like
if I
we
would
don't have
say-
any, right now, for example, we have no regulations on residential lighting.
No, we do in the building code. We do in the building
Or
code.
for like all
Or a
residential
single-family
zones?
home, yeah, we do.
Okay, thank you.
Right?
Okay. Kind of further continuing that, we've also got standards for some of the most common things that you see as they are built. In particular, a lot of these probably hit on the residential side, more so than commercial. So looking at things like fences and walls, where they can locate, how tall they can be, their installation standards, materials that are prohibited for use as a fence, fairly typical, just really kind of spelling them out. We've worked with staff to incorporate recent looks at the window escape well issue, so that's what you really see there. That was closely working with staff. Reuse and recycling containers. These are dumpsters. This is not your personal home garbage can that you kind of wheel out or outside. This is for more significant things. So things like screening required for those to kind of make sure that they're hidden from view. And some basic performance standards that are appropriate to a zoning code for things like noise and heat, vibration. These are really just meant to balance out any impacts that may come from uses. You have stronger, bigger nuisance standards within other sections of the code. This is not what zoning is intended to accomplish. And then finally, the last part of this is the permitted encroachments. What this is a series of architectural features. Again, that's just an excerpt of the full table that is located in the code. That really just talks about things like an eave and how much it can encroach into a required setback. The intent there is really to allow for these architectural features so you get good-looking buildings, because if they don't have a little bit of leeway, they're going to end up pushing back into the lot and becoming more flat surfaces. So this allows for some level of kind of just interest on the facade. Fairly typical to many communities. Work closely on a couple of the issues that are particular to Elmhurst, things like stoops, but really this is something that is very valuable to allow for people to have, kind of allow them to do good architecture. Okay. Off-street parking. What you'll see here is something that's tied back to that use table that you saw. So we have updated ratios for all the different off-street all the different uses. This minimizes interpretation. So basically, if the use is sitting in the use table, it's got a corresponding parking requirement in this, as well as a minimum number, in some cases, not all cases, of minimum bicycle spaces. We revised the gross floor area measurement, and in addition to updating those parking ratios, we made it simpler. We just basically said the gross floor area is the building, but then did some adjustments on the ratios. So you no longer have to go through kind of the hassle of trying to figure out what counts, what doesn't count. Let's just make it easy. Let's adjust the ratios to reflect that and kind of move forward from there. There's also some additional things that are in here, the multi-tenant developments, again, where you have 3 or more non-residential tenants, so small retail center. The intent here to create one standard regardless of the uses in there is so that they don't float in and out of nonconformity status. So we just look at the center as a whole, and there's 3 or more grouped together as one building or 3 tenants in one building, and allow us to use that standard as well. There are parking maximums in the central business district, the core, the outer core residential. These are current. We just brought those in and maintained them as they are now. And then again, as I pointed out, the bicycle parking, you see that table there. It talks about your parking ratios. It also talks about minimum bike ratios in certain cases. Few things that are... Oh.
Alderman Virgil?
Yeah. So you mentioned that these standards are simplified a little bit in terms of the parking minimums and so forth. Does it result in any material change from what we have now?
It kind of depends on how you define that. I think the ratios are a little bit more logical based on kind of how uses are used and the measurements of the whole full gross floor area. I don't think the intent was to take anything in a massive states of nonconformity. The intent wasn't to take anything in a massive states of nonconformity, just to be clear there.
But do you think the amount of parking required is similar to what it was before, or is it more, is it less?
I think it's relatively similar. There may be some uses where it's a little less. I mean, you didn't have this structure of going use to parking ratio, so there may be some things that are a little bit different, but I couldn't tell you that just kind of off the top of my head.
Thanks.
Okay. So we have some additional, still kind of in the parking world, we have some additional flexibilities here. As we know, the central business district was considered exempt. We also exempted the C1 district, which again, kind of the lowest commercial. So really the intent there is these are things that are, one is your downtown area, the other one is your lowest level commercial, to not burden them into nonconformity situations because of parking requirements. You currently have a residential parking zones map that was brought into the code and referenced, so that's the current provisions. We just wanted to make sure that everybody using the code was aware of it, as well as the current provisions for land banked parking, where you can reserve part of a parking lot area in green space until such time as it's called in to be used. So that's really what we're looking at there. And again, current provision brought in from the current code.
Alderman Toledo?
Regarding parking, is there any change to the code to account for the changes in modern life? Specifically, I'm talking about delivery trucks and parking for delivery trucks to commercial or multifamily residential buildings, as well as things like DoorDash, food deliveries, Ubers. What we have found in some of our newer multifamily, like apartment building developments, is it has been more successful to ask the builder to accommodate that within their design, but it's not required for them to do it in our code. Can you speak to that, either in our code and or your professional experience on that?
The code currently doesn't speak to that. It doesn't require building design to allow for pickup drop-off areas. You're starting to see it a little bit more, but at this point we haven't, just kind of from a professional stance, come up with it. It's more a, what's the phrase? more a hammer than a scalpel. I think I'm mixing up two things. So to say that every building coming in over a certain size has to have this can create more problems for you and more issues with variances and things like that. So it really is kind of more a case-by-case basis. Also, what we're seeing is that in new developments elsewhere, and I'm not speaking for Elmhurst, but in elsewhere, those are kind of being brought into the site design anyway, because that's how people are using the Grubhub, Uber, whatever. So that's kind of being brought in different ways. So at this point, there's no best practice for it. It's something that's desirable, but we just don't have the tools to say every single building should have this.
Thank you.
So many of the other things in parking, again, these are fairly typical. You currently have some location restrictions for non-residential uses. So when you have a parking lot that's remote and abutting residential, it must be a conditional use. That has been maintained. Very basic design standards on parking facilities and bike spaces. Again, parking lots, parking structures. It's not architecture design. These are just, please don't hit each other when you're parking your cars type level standards. There are some standards for EV parking. If you have, obviously you are free to do them if you would like. But what we thought a good starting point at this point would be if you've got a parking lot or a structure over 35 spaces, that there be some requirement for EV spaces coming in. So 10% of spaces or 10 spaces, whichever is less. That's kind of where this draft has ended up. It's going to help to build in that EV infrastructure. There's off-street loading requirements and designs, some updates to the number of spaces, no permissions to not have them in front of buildings. Again, this is on the private property. What you're doing on the street is outside the realm of the zoning code. So really, and then finally, kind of closing out this section, commercial vehicles, where you can park commercial vehicles in residential districts. Basically, maintaining passenger-sized vehicles can park where other passenger-sized vehicles can park. And then recreational vehicles where those could park, things like a boat, trailer, RV. So really just making sure there's standards in place for where those can go on a lot.
Can I ask a question? So on the off-street loading, not allowed in front of building, I feel like there's a number of buildings in our commercial district where there is no rear to load. Is that something that we've thought about?
Really, when we were looking at this, is really not allowing for new loading spaces in the front of a building. So if they're in the front of the building now, that building is non-conforming, it gets to continue. We're not doing anything about it, but as new development.
These are just loading spaces. You're not saying it doesn't apply to a delivery truck that's bringing, Starbucks all their coffee at 10 at night?
No, this is like an industrial use that is getting shipments. That's part of their operations. It's a loading dock. Thank you. Loading dock is probably a better way to describe that. Yes, because loading spaces can be on the street, and the way that works, and that's outside of the purview of the zoning code. So, related to really where you see landscape kick in quite a bit is within the parking. They're kind of cousins. And so really what we want to make sure is that we've got a comprehensive set of landscape standards in place. So you can see we talk about these general standards, which types of plants to select, how to install them, some minimum sizes to make sure that the trees and the shrubs take, allowing for various rain gardens and bioswales to meet these requirements. And essentially what we want to do is address parking lot landscape, or address landscape in really three areas. First two are related. The perimeter of a parking lot where it's abutting a street in order to screen the cars along that part of a parking lot, as well as the parking lot interior on larger parking lots in order to make sure that there's some greenery and landscape in there, heat island effect, stormwater management. And then finally, the other one is buffer yards, really creating some landscape standards and fencing and screening between incompatible uses. So this would be where, say, a non-residential use abuts a residential use, you would have a buffer yard requirement in place. So just some quick examples of what these are. These come from the code. You can see here a couple of alternatives for parking lot perimeter landscape, so when you're abutting the street. The parking lot interior landscape, again, heat island, stormwater, just getting some greenery within that area. And then finally, buffer yards. And one of the buffer yards does have a provision for when the lot is very shallow, which is that second image that you see there. The shallow lot one, just really some shrubs and basically a fence, just acknowledging the fact that you've got some very shallow lots that may be abutting things like residential. We want some screening, but we don't want to make things onerous for anybody involved. And kind of finishing off the development standards, the last part of it is signs. One of the most important things, and probably why signs looks kind of different from what you've seen, aside from it being completely reorganized, we have to maintain content neutrality. It is very important not to look at the content of the sign, so that was a big change that came throughout the whole code in terms of how we talk about signs, how we define them. These are Supreme Court rulings that we have to adhere to. So really, when we looked at signs, we wanted to make sure that we addressed all the different categories that are in place. These include prohibited signs, signs that are exempt from permit, but still have standards in order to make sure that they're, not contributing to sign clutter, and then signs that do require a permit. And then we went through and really tailored the types of signs that we would allow to the district form, so that the signs are complementing what we're asking the buildings to do. So you'll see some signs are bigger in certain districts, smaller in others. They may not even be allowed in certain other districts. And then finally, we defined and prohibited cabinet box wall signs. There's a definition for that. These are just these box signs that have a plastic sheet with some lighting behind it. We found them to be, at the time that the drafting was coming, that they didn't really contribute character-wise, and that we want to have other types of signs in their place. So those are one of the new categories of prohibited. Ooh, nope. Okay. Then finally, kind of closing out the end, a lot of this is from the state. This is really where you get into how things like conditional uses and variances and things operate. There's a little bit of leeway to look at the process, but in general, it really is something that the standards are established through court cases and through the state, so we have to be kind of really on top of that. So you'll see here we outlined the duties of all the different administrators. We looked at the general process. How do I apply for something? What happens once I apply? What type of notice is required? You can see the table there that talks about that as well. And just some general comments about a public hearing. Again, as I just talked about, we did some updates to comply with the state requirements. We clarified the expiration of a conditional use, a variance, and a zoning certificate, so when actually the approval expires. For map amendments, we removed the limitation on council to approve a different zoning district than one requested. If you think it's more appropriate as a C2 than a C3, you should have the ability to be able to do that. So we wanted to make sure that that was in there. And then you had a weird requirement about 1 year for review if no development. Basically, we refined this to say the zoning administrator will take a look at it and recommend review if needed. The variation process has some flexibilities built in, really looking at administrative, minor, and major. So really there's ways to look at small things that are just fairly typical all the way up through bigger issues that come through. Really clarified what happens with site plan review, just making sure we're noting exactly who's subject to site plan review. It's really putting out the triggers there, and then it's reviewed against the ordinance. And then just a couple new applications. A zoning text interpretation process. This happens almost every day. This is just a formal process. A temporary use permit for temporary uses that come in so that you can control them and monitor them and make sure they don't become permanent uses. And then we added a reasonable accommodation provision, and this is something new that's coming into codes. It's ways to allow for things to be modified to accommodate persons with disabilities. It's a very specific thing related to federal and state statutes on ADA, so really just allowing for that to happen. And it's something we're seeing throughout cities across the country.
All right, Alderman Ardini, then Alderman Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you use other words for the map amendment, remove limitations on council approval of a different zoning district than requested? I don't understand.
Basically, there was a limitation that said you couldn't, so it's like the example. Somebody comes to you for a C3 rezoning, and currently you don't have the ability to say, I think a C2 would be better. Can we just do a C2? This got rid of that limitation, and you can have the discussion with the applicant and everybody to say, hey, the C2 is actually better. Let's work on that one. So,
Alderman Hill.
Thank you, Mayor. With the added flexibility, can you tell me a little bit more about the rationale for that, or, not that I'm saying I disagree with it, I just am curious, like, what was the thought, or what was the experiences that led to this being a general recommendation?
So really, it's a fairly typical thing that if you can do it, everybody wants to have it. You're allowing the zoning administrator to approve incredibly tiny small variances that are typical and not having to go through the full process. You're still looking at it as if it's a hardship, that it's not self-created, all of those things that are in play, but it's really a way to allow people to do things like make improvements to their existing homes without having to go through a lengthy process that goes through that. So this is really saying, you need a foot, I can see why you need a foot, you can have it. The zoning administrator can always kick that up back to the zoning board of appeals or whoever and say, I'm not comfortable making this decision, you have to go there. Obviously, the decision of the zoning administrator can be appealed, but really what we're seeing, it provides this small level of flexibility that benefits you in various different ways. It just makes the whole variance process less onerous.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Alderman Irby, sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to tag on to Alderman Hill's question and Alderman Nardini's map amendment. That first bullet seems problematic to me because if someone applies to move from we just had one come through that moved from we had two separate districts. It was considered as one project, and they moved from an O1 to an R4 on one side of the road. On the other side of the road, they moved from a C2, if I remember correctly, to an R4. And right now, they have to come through council to change the zoning map. Map amendment is just a fancy word for changing the zoning map.
Yeah.
Which is a major thing in my book.
Yes.
It's not to be taken lightly, and why would we, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the bullet, but why would I take council's approval away from changing the zoning map?
It's not taking council approval. A map amendment has to be done through the current process you have now. What you have now is a tiny little quirk that says, in your example, or the example I was using, that when somebody comes before them with an application to change from, I'm just going to keep using the same example, they want to rezone their property to a C3. Council doesn't see C3 as being appropriate. They see C2 as something more appropriate and want to have that discussion with the applicant and say, hey, we think you might be better off as a C2. Are you okay with that? And they say, yeah, okay, I could do the C2. You currently are not allowed to do that as a council. You're not allowed to suggest a different zoning district. That's what this is talking about. It removed that limitation. There's a weird line in there that basically says you can't look at other zoning districts. This is all, nothing is being taken away from council.
Okay, except for the variation. So the way I understand, and then, so this goes over to Alderman Hill's question that you answered, and I just want to clarify it for myself. The variation comes up and it's a 5% variance, whatever it is. Vanilla, chocolate, ice cream, I don't care. So it's a small variance. And the way I understand the new update here is we do not have to approve that. It'll be an administrative approval when it's under a certain percentage variance. As soon as that threshold is crossed, then council or ZPZ, DPZ, and full council gets involved. Can you elaborate on how that's going to work?
Yeah,
it's not on the sheet as what percentage that threshold is.
Yeah, the language is within the draft code. It lays out the thresholds for what would be considered administrative and what would be considered minor. Anything that exceeds administrative and doesn't exceed minor would be minor. Anything that exceeds minor would be major. So there's specific thresholds laid out of how much percentage of a variance in certain situations. And it's not just a blanket, the whole ordinance 10%. It's laid out in terms of what can be modified by 10%. So that's really kind of your initial threshold on the administrative. So 10%, but you can't change building height, you can't change building coverage. That is always considered a major major variance that would be coming through council. Small reductions to a dimensional standard of design standards, reduction of bicycle parking, minor modifications to the landscape that don't reduce the number of plant materials that are required, additional sign materials that are not listed as permitted but would be appropriate. So they're very specifically spelled out. And then there's a whole other set that goes into minor for the Zoning Board of Appeals. In any of those cases, they can always just be bumped up. If the zoning administrator or the ZBA doesn't want their hands on it, they can always bump it up to another process. So they're really specifically, they're drawn, as you look at the language in the code, as to when each of these is allowed.
All right, thank you.
Alderman Toledo?
I'll just add I've served on the DPZ committee, and actually former Alderman Deuter and myself have spoken to Director Franz about this many times. I think that this is not only probably her professional experience, but also experience of the city. There are a lot of very small variances that are cumbersome to the applicant and to city council to go through the full process. So I think this added flexibility is a great addition to the code change from a longer term perspective of someone seeing a lot of these cases over 14, almost 12 years.
And again, we're not here to, we don't have to debate it.
Yeah.
I just want you to understand what's being proposed. DP will go through the usual process then, so. All right, go ahead, thank you.
Okay. That was very loud, I'm sorry. So then we also spent some time kind of early on in the process, we started looking at the plan development requirements, and this is something that we've kind of built in from those early discussions. I was given videos of meetings to watch, and this is kind of where this came in. So a couple of the things to refine your current plan development process. So it's not really taking this out of kind of what you're familiar with, but there's some quirks here or tweaks here we want to point out. The first is there's no process for modifications once you have a PD approved. So again, very similar to the variance process are these modifications that are allowed by the zoning administrator, the ZPC, the village board, in terms of modifications allowed to approve plan development. So I'm doing something, I have to move a walkway 2 feet because of the site engineering, that could be something that's an administrative modification, kind of then escalates up to more public processes once you're out of those very little things. So it's very similar to the variance. We also added in a requirement for enhanced design and public amenities. So this is something really to make sure that a plan development is contributing to a high quality, attractive environment. It's very flexible in terms of what that means. So it could be anything from a plaza to community space to just the type of development as a whole is something that's beneficial, such as workforce housing, senior housing. And so really it's something to evaluate this. And then we looked at the thresholds for plan development and kind of when it would be required when you are doing development to kick you into the plan development process. And so these were really what we looked at. You can see here, in many of them, it's a 2-acre limit. When you look at the office district, you look at the commercial, you look at the industrial, that's kicking you to a 5-acre limit. So it's really meant to refine these. And then our final section, a couple of things in place here. Nonconformities. What's really important here is that we always look at nonconformities by the type they are, and that we're very specific regarding what kind of nonconformity we're looking at. So just to make sure that we've got them defined and we talk about how they can continue for each type, we look at uses, we look at structures, we look at nonconforming lots of record, and we look at nonconforming signs. And you'll see everything spelled out for each of those in there. There's 2 exceptions that we wanted to point out. The first was really taking a look at kind of a common thing that has occurred here in Elmhurst, and you're not the only ones. This is very common in many neighborhoods. Existing nonconforming dwellings in residential districts. What we wanted to do, so for example, this would be a legally built 2-family that's sitting in a single-family district. And what we wanted to do was deem that conforming so it's not subject to nonconformity provisions, as long as it was legal prior to that date you see here, which we did a lot of digging on, and I can't exactly remember where it came from, but it was a lot of digging. so it was relevant. And then essentially you can continue to do that without being subject to the nonconformity provisions. If you tear it down, if you convert it back to, say, two-family, back to single-family, if it's damaged by more than 50%, that permission goes away. So basically what we're saying, if you're here, you're legal, room want to let you continue, you're providing a kind of mix of densities that people might not even be aware of, until such time as you don't want to do it anymore. We also allowed for the extension of a non-conforming wall for single-family and two-family. And really the best way to imagine this is that if I'm a single-family house and I'm a little bit too far into my interior side setback, but I want to put a second story on, so I want to extend the life of my little house. This allows you to do that without having to set back that second story, so to create kind of a weird kind of bump out, which is expensive and can look very strange. It allows you to do that so long as I comply with everything else. So heights, coverages, other setbacks. Basically, it's only that dimension that we're talking about. So it allows for people to do improvements on their homes without having to get variances. But again, for that one specific element, it does not let you violate anything else that is within the code. And so with that, there is the website, which has a number of things on it, basically everything from when we started way back when, and I guess 2019. I will be putting this PowerPoint up there tomorrow when I'm back at my desk, and I can update the website. But with that, still happy to take any additional questions.
And note that it's not our city website, it's a separate website.
Yeah, elmhurstzoning.com.
Right. All right. Alderman Virgil.
I'm not sure who this question is most appropriate for, but in the zoning code, if we have anything that is maybe not in compliance with state law at some point, and I'm thinking of specifically around like the recently passed transit law, where they are prohibiting parking minimums within half a mile of train station. Do we do anything to update the code in those cases?
There's going to be, well, and it's not necessarily on your radar yet, but I was going to make a couple comments. I'll throw them in now. So last session, there was a part of the transit bill provision that said you couldn't require certain parking, like 1.5 or 2 within a distance like from our train station. So by way of example, if the ECPA building got built, you couldn't require parking. There's a trailer bill that gained some momentum saying that would apply to municipalities over 2 million, and there's one of those, Chicago. But at the same time, there's another set of bills that have been introduced, which DMMC is pretty active in, and it was really just announced in the governor's message, which said, like you couldn't have single-family districts. You couldn't prohibit
Multifamily.
You couldn't prohibit multifamily. You couldn't prohibit ADUs. I should say you can't if it passes. You would, and it would have a statewide building code. And some of these are kind of hard to fathom because one of the cornerstones of local control is zoning. But and there's substantial momentum that some things might happen, but as I was just saying with city manager, like we have to do what we have to do because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Maybe something will preempt everything, maybe none of that will come to pass. So those are the kind of things that are happening, but we have to do what's best for Elmhurst now.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I guess what I was getting at, just maybe more of in a general sense, if there is something that's preempted at the state level, do we have to do anything with our code?
Well, it depends. If it applies to these changes that I mentioned that are under consideration, would be, home rule would not be able to go around them. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where these are going to come out. There were some things under code, like our sign ordinance was out of compliance with Supreme Court law about content. So we've waited to bring that there up. But I don't know that. I think as part of the review, if there was anything that state law would have said you can't do this anymore, or you can't do this in the proposed code, that would be.
Yeah, we've been mindful to stay on the right side of state law and turn to Andy when we've needed kind of legal opinion, and looked at things like the content neutrality for signs like community residences, which comes under kind of Fair Housing Act, to make sure we're compliant with that. You're obviously clearly not the only ones in this situation. When stuff comes down from the state and they say something like you have to allow ADUs, you don't have a choice. You're just going to have to amend the code to stick it in there. But we never recommend doing anything until that bill is final and it's got an effective date attached to it.
Okay, so you're saying we would need to actually update the code at some point?
You would the thing is, the state's going to control, period. Whether you update your code or not, the state preempts you, so.
Yeah, I guess, sorry,
Well, that's exactly it. It's like, that's why I say we had our sign ordinance that said kind of regulated, like political signs. I think it's the best example. Our current ordinance says you can't put up political signs unless, 60 days before the election. Well, that's a regulation of content. So you can put out your political signs whenever you want. Now, it's good to clean up the code so that people who don't understand what federal law is, didn't read that particular Supreme Court case, would know and say, why do you have it on your books if it's not there? But so this is intended to clean that up. If a state law passed, for instance, said, we say no ADUs, and they say you have to allow them, it would automatically preempt our code, but we would clean it up to take it out.
I see. Okay.
And I think the one thing you'll see is kind of as you look at the code, and going back to kind of my third slide that talked about compartmentalization, you're at a much easier position to amend the code to add things you need to add, because you're not going to be sticking them in general provisions and hoping people see it. It's going to be tied in a logical section where you want it. So it should be easier to drop it in if something happens. But yeah.
Thanks.
Alderman Brennan?
Yep. So if I understand the process, there are a few open houses. What was the general feedback to these changes from those in attendance?
So in general, I'm going to say a couple things. So in general, it was a lot of people just coming to get information and just kind of come to understand what's in the code. At that time, we had ADUs as permitted within the code, and that was the biggest hot button issue. That is almost pretty much everything that we heard. People were divided on both sides of that issue, and as you look back through the drafts, you'll see there was ADU language, and then the decision was made, because it is such a hot button issue for Elmhurst, to pull it out and deal with it separately. So that was really a lot of what we saw within the open houses. I don't know if you guys remember anything. That was the most controversial. So in order to facilitate this code moving forward and not kind of get it sidetracked, the idea was to remove ADUs and address them separately. Like I said, you can just drop them into accessory structures once you're ready.
Thank you.
All right, Alderman Toludo.
Yeah, in general, are you in a position to characterize whether you think that this zoning rewrite adds regulations or removes regulations?
It does both. It's really hard. I mean, there are things in the current code that, like the use structure is very specific and difficult. I think when we did it, you had something like 300 uses when we cataloged them. So now you don't have 300 uses. But I think the regulation, even though it's less regulation than the current approach, it is tighter and kind of takes care of common issues. I think the idea here for us really wasn't whether something should be more restrictive or more permissive. It was to look at each of the individual issues that were emerging and address them that way, and try to address everything simply so that it's not difficult to understand what you can and can't do. I don't think that answered your question, but that's a really tough one to say,
Yeah, and that's why I guess I asked if you had, because you and these ladies here sitting down here are probably the closest to the current and the proposed new, and so I wanted to see if there was a way to have a general overview of that. I guess my concern, like at a very high level, is I would prefer to reduce regulation, because the more regulation that we add, the more expensive it is to build, and we're actually trying to make things more affordable to build. And so I can follow up with Director Franz as well and just talk through that a little bit with her generically offline. But that's the impetus behind my question.
And that's the philosophy that we take when you're doing a code update. That's why it's kind of impossible to compare. It's not like you can do a tally on one and the other and do that. We wanted to allow the things that you want to happen. So we needed to write regulations that allowed them to happen and not get into a whole variety of special approvals or weird interpretations. And then for things that, we needed to be a little bit more concerned about, either we could write a regulation or we could tailor an approval process to that. Did you want to say, I could see you moving from the side.
Sorry, I guess what I would just say is, one of the last slides talked about the nonconformities and allowing people to put an addition on a second-story addition, or to do, an addition to the rear of their home that is staying on the same plane. Like, I would say that's an example of we're lessening regulations for people. We're letting people improve their homes without needing to go through a variation. But then there are other areas that we deal with every day that are may not seem like a big deal to the general population, but they are a big deal to our building staff and zoning staff, and some areas where we needed to actually be a little more explicit on an interpretation. So I think it's a balance of some areas where there are less restrictions, and then there are some areas where there are a little more areas that we felt needed it based on, some of our plans and just some of the day-to-day dealings that we have.
All right. Alderman Irby, then Alderman Bastido. Oh, you want Alderman Bastido first?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go up alphabetically.
So my question is about the process. The changes went to DPZ committee. My understanding is they made some changes and it went to the commission. Did they give explanations when they sent it to the commission? Was there an explanation from the committee why they made the changes they did, or did they just send an edited version to the commission?
I don't know that our consultant knows that.
I'm asking, it could be for staff,
Yeah.
whoever wants to answer.
I'm not.
So it was the draft went to both the Zoning and Planning Commission and the DPZ committee, and comments were made by both bodies and then passed along to the consultant. Things might be documented in minutes or just in, notes that we took and passed along to the consultant. Mm-hmm. So I guess there was probably more discussion on some things than others. If you had a specific area, I could probably get you a better answer on it.
I just know that there was criticism at the commission that some of the changes weren't explained well enough. And I just didn't see in what was sent to them where the committee really had a chance to explain their reasoning. And so that's why I was just curious. I know that there was a lot of testimony at the commission, that they have a much different process. So that's why I was just curious if the commission was critical that they didn't feel like they got enough explanation. I didn't know maybe where that was allowed, but it sounds like it was just in the notes that you guys took and the discussions that you passed along from the committee?
Notes, meeting minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Alderman Irby.
Yeah, following up on Alderman Bastido's great point of the process. So June 13th, the circle back memo started back in DPZ. After they cleared the ZPZ hoop, as far as I knew, there were 129 items, a 19-page PDF. There was another one that was 7 pages long. It had 46 items. So there were really 2 circle backs, or maybe it's 1, but anyway, there were 2 documents floating around that DPZ was going through, and they had a total of 14 meetings that I know of going through those circle backs. And I never could tap in or get a feel for where that, what happened to them, what was their resolution, what were the changes. So there was a no move, add, change document that I ever saw from that circle back memo. So it's very difficult for me on council or probably the public to know what happened in that process. Maybe it's all there and I just haven't hit it, but that was my exact point there. Secondly, if it's okay, the table 9.1, shouldn't we be using that as our friend by putting items in there not to complicate the code, but to add items to the table, say, for instance, a truck stop. Right now, we just have gas station. So, we've had some cases that we've worked on, they're still on the zoning, on the dock, lined up, where maybe we don't want that hybrid gas station. So I'm using that as an example, not to harp on the process, but the more items we can get into that zoning table, 9-1, it seems like gives us the ability to either not permit it, et cetera. And if it's not in the table or not defined in the cross section over there on the right on the table, then how can we ever stop a data center? How can we ever stop a truck stop, et cetera, by not getting to that table? So if you could elaborate a little bit on that table and how we could do that.
So the table lists a whole series of uses. Some are more kind of general in nature, so things like a retail goods establishment without filling out every type of retail that's allowed. And then others do get a little bit more specific. So you look at something like a drive-through facility specifically spelled out. We had the data center issue. Data center's actually in that table now because we had the issues of that coming up. So you'll see that some of them get pulled out, and once it's specifically defined, it can't be part of any other category, and it's only allowed in those districts that are indicated. If you have a use come up and it doesn't match any of the kind of use definitions that you have, by the laws of Article 9, it's not permitted. So what you would need to do is you would need to, if you wanted to allow something, you would need to amend the table. If you can't interpret it as part of another use, you need to amend the table to add it in there, make sure it has a definition that's associated with it, and then if it has any standards you want, to add those along with it too. And it all goes into Article 9, so it's a very easy process to do that. If there are uses coming up that you don't want to allow, you just need to kind of take a look and see if the table would allow them in any kind of way, shape, or form. Does the definition need to be changed? Does additional standards need to be placed to keep things out? The document can't capture everything all at once immediately, so it is, in a certain sense, a living document as you're kind of using it. Now, don't amend it every week, please, but as things come up, you're going to have to address. We can't anticipate everything, and that's really, I think, where this came from. I think this is a more flexible way to allow uses that you do want, and it's a way to make interpretations that can help you keep uses you don't want out as well.
Were you able to get to that circle back menu memos, and were you a part of that? Or was that purely outside of your domain with the circle backs?
Sorry, if I may, thank you for bringing up the circle back memos. That was a way that we were documenting the changes through the Zoning and Planning Commission and the DPZ committee. So it started out with a very, very long memo, and as those items were addressed, they were no longer kept on the memo. So you do need to go through those memos to look at them, and if one does not appear on the next one, it was addressed, likely through the answer that was on the previous memo related to that item, and we did pass those along to the consultant.
All right, any other questions? What we're going to do, well, first of all, it would be remiss if I didn't thank our planning staff, Eileen Franz and Jessica Gall, and also, they're not here, but our Zoning and Planning Commission, who put in a lot of hard work. And the work goes on. So from here, it will go to our committee, and it will go through the regular process of their careful consideration. They've already spent a good amount of time on it, and they will then formulate a report that they will bring back to council. It's an important project. It's taken a lot of time, but it's, I think particularly the simplification of the code is going to be something that is, from my time on DPZ, from talking to developers, those are some good things to look at modern uses. I see we don't have haberdasheries anymore in there, so that's how long it's been since some of this has been updated. So thank you for your time coming out tonight. It was very informative, and I think it sets us up on the path so that we all understand what's happened and where we're going to go from here.
Thank you very much.
All right. So with that, I think unless there's an objection, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Alderman Brennan with a motion, Alderman Bastido with a second. All in favor, say aye. Oh, wait,
Aye.
roll call. We got someone up there. Roll call, please.
Toludo.
Aye.
Baker? Alderman Baker?
Baker?
Aye.
Nudera?
Aye.
Virgil?
Aye.
Nardini?
Aye.
Bastido?
Aye.
Irby?
Aye.
Brennan?
Aye.
Varimus? Bellinger?
Aye.
Shanko?
Aye.
Hill?
Aye.
Graham?
Aye.
Jensen?
Aye.
14 ayes, 0 nays.
14 ayes, 0 nays. We're adjourned. Thank you and good night.